Hi everyone. This video is going to be about social justice fallacies by Thomas Sowell. For those of you who don't know who is Thomas Sowell, he is an amazing recognized economist in the United States. And I personally very much like him because it doesn't matter if I listen to an interview of him or if I read a book of him, he is able to showcase a vast amount of knowledge in a very easy way to understand. Uh, he's, he's just really good at simplifying things just so that us mortals that are not economists can understand all sort of things, particularly statistics, and how important it is to read, not only to read statistics because it's not as simple as it might appear, but also to be able to see how people in the media, in the academia, and in the government tend to use statistics just for their own agenda. It doesn't matter if it's ideological, political, economical, the statistics are always they are full of nuances, and it's very important to understand it so that we don't get easily manipulated. So one of the main things to take in consideration is that there are several factors involved when it comes to any statistic, and because of this is that it's important to not have a simplistic mindset, or because sometimes we might not even see or acknowledge that we are having a simplistic mindset, and it can be because we simply don't know about statistics. So one of the points that he wants to be very clear in the book from the very beginning is that we shouldn't assume that because there are economic or other disparities that exceed any innate capabilities of humans, it means that there is like an oppression or an exploitation of certain individuals. Because people tend to think in this simple way, which is just like the oppressed and oppressor. And there is so much more at play than just this one factor. Human biases are not the only factor in disparities. And it's also important that equal chances for everyone might be a desirable thing, but that doesn't mean that it's realistic or feasible goal, especially when you want to take in consideration other important matters for the individuals, such as freedom and survival. And it's also important that biases can also make us want to read certain statistics through a specific lens that won't necessarily make us go or make us reach the correct conclusion. And it's also important to not give that much emphasis to catchwords, especially when we are presented with evidence that go against our bias. If we are presented with such evidence, then we should listen to it, we should take a look at it, and then proceed from there. Another important point is that equal opportunities is not the same as equal outcomes. People from different backgrounds may want different things in this life, and it goes not only from different races and different types of groups, but it also happens within the same groups. Not all Hispanics are gonna want to dedicate their lives to specific professions, and just how once are a factor, there are so many others that we should always take in consideration. And it's also important because throughout history, there have been minorities that have excelled and exceeded dominant majorities. For example, in commerce, Jews were the ones that would excel at it. Or in the Ottoman Empire, like not one Turk could own any private bank, even when Turks were the ones running the Ottoman Empire. And just like this, we're gonna see several examples of racial minorities being like representing or being in charge of more than half of the whole industry and different industries. Some of these examples are like the Chinese in Malaysia, Germans in Brazil, Italians in Argentina, Lebanese in West Africa, Indians in East Africa, Scots in Britain. Like there are different examples to showcase this. Some are better at certain things than others, and that doesn't mean that they are oppressing a group. It simply means that they have chose to dedicate themselves to a specific profession. And for example, one example for this is that Scots are the ones that lead the whiskey industry, or French lead the wine industry, Germans the beer. And similar circumstances had different histories, cultures, and outcomes in particular endeavors, because endeavors are important. And this Sowell calls it as reciprocal inequalities, just because people have different interests. I mean, again, that is one of the many factors. Because people are hired for their developed capabilities, which have been due to their talents and the dedication they have given to such capability. And the more narrow these endeavors are, the less likely there will be like an equal representation of races. And we can take the example of sports. Like in basketball, there are more blacks. In baseball, there are more Hispanics. In tennis, there are more whites. And in hockey, there are more Canadians. And this happens because there are different backgrounds, but even in these different backgrounds, there are different climates. So it makes it easier or more accessible for certain people to develop their skills in certain endeavors. Hockey being the clearest example of these ones. And when people develop on different settings, they will develop different talents, which will create reciprocal inequalities. This quote from Fernand Braudel is like, in no society have all regions and all parts of the population developed equally. And it's because of what I have just mentioned, and it's also that endeavors have purposes. Let's take, for example, the cancer research. Do you want the scientists and the doctors to be selected by their race and their sexes so that everyone has an equal percentage of that industry without having any regard for their skills, which if you hire the people that have developed those skills the most, then it will be more possible to reach like the cure of cancer. What would you prefer? People that are really good at their job, or just people with specific features of specific groups, just so that you have the equal outcome that you're looking for. And On top of this, there are other factors that are completely unpredictable, like famines, wars, and epidemics. On top of this, there are natural differences. I have just touched about the climate in one, because geography, it's one of the main differences that no one has control over it. It's also important to understand potentialities and capabilities. Yes, we might all have the potential to become everything in this world, but there are certain things that prevent the potential to develop these capabilities. Among those is geography, as I have mentioned a little bit, because depends on which part of the world you are in, depends the type of climate there will be in it, and no one has control over this. One of the examples that it's in this book, it's the coastline between Africa and Europe. Africa, I found this particular example very interesting and enlightened to some degree. So one of the examples that Sowell gives in this book is the difference in the coastlines between Africa and Europe. Even though Africa has a larger coast than Europe in terms of, they have so much that gives to the sea. Not everything is good for harbor, for the ships to park. And this is because it is because of the sea. It's simple as that. It's just because the ships can't harbor in safe areas where you can move the merchandise. And Europe has several connections to the sea where it's safe, because the land is kind of surrounding those patches of water, so it makes it safer for ships to go there. So they have more of these harbors, and obviously by having more of them, you're able to move more merchandise, and it's a geographical advantage that no one had any control over it. Another factor to take in consideration is that it is in the coast where there have been a larger range of economic and social interactions with other coast people. And this has helped the people in the coast to improve their knowledge and lifestyle faster than people from the inland. And in a good amount, like a general pattern has been that these coast places have been the first one to develop, and then especially when we're talking about metropolitan, I believe, and this coast, once they developed, it starts like spreading to the inland. Again, it's just geography. It's just how it happens as a general pattern. Different parts of the world have different climates, which have different type of agriculture. In some, it's easier to grow crops than in other ones, and some crops don't grow in certain places and others do. Again, it's just how it is. No one has control of this. And this will be actually a good factor to take in consideration when we are studying the history of when Europeans arrived to America. So there were so many differences, but three are the main ones. That is the vessels, the animals, and the immune system. So because Europe was more interconnected, as in compared to America, Native Americans to the Mayans or the Incas, as in America, the different natives didn't have communication between them. If they could have had communication, maybe things would have been different. But in Europe, because I mean they're tiny compared to United States, so they're different cultures, they're different groups of people could interact with one another way more than again Americans could have interact with them, which caused several advantages for Europeans. Among them, it was the increase of knowledge and even diseases. Europeans had several diseases that would destroy a good amount of their population, but this helped them to create stronger immune systems compared to the Native Americans, that they didn't have, because they didn't have that much interaction with others, they didn't suffer from diseases. So when the Europeans arrived and they had all these bacteria in their bodies, and it just spread naturally to the natives, it really destroyed like half of their population, and this was a key factor for them to conquer so easily. And when we look at the knowledge, for example, the Europeans, I mean, okay, so they arrived also with vessels, because with all this knowledge that they were exchanging, they were able to, especially also with the Chinese, they were able to create huge vessels that could make them capable to cross the sea, compared to the natives of America, where they, because they didn't have this knowledge, they only had canoes that obviously you cannot cross the entire ocean with a canoe. And another interesting factor that I liked, it was that, for example, they also arrived with big animals, which again in America, and when I say America in this case, I mean the entire continent, we didn't have that. So, for example, the Incas, they had llamas, but the Mayans didn't have big animals. And this is actually a very important factor, because because the Mayans and the Incas weren't in touch with one another, so they couldn't take full advantage of what they had, because they had lesser knowledge. And how this affected is that, for example, the Mayans, they created the wheel, or well, they just, but because they didn't know that there were bigger animals such as the llamas, it never occurred to them to make an animal pull merchandise or stuff, with carts, because they didn't have the big animals. And the Incas, they didn't have the wheel, so the amount of goods that they were able to transport from one part to another, it was much lesser than the one the Europeans were able to do at the time. So all these differences is what made it so easy for Europeans to conquer the different parts of the natives. So the lack of knowledge, it affects the skills that a society has at a time. And this has happened throughout the centuries around the world. One more recent example could be, for example, that Germans are the ones that lead the beer industry, because they had developed beer through the entire of time. As in they have produced beer for longer than any other society. So they lead the current industry, and they are overrepresented in the United States, in Europe, in Argentina, Brazil, and Australia. So it just happened again because their society have developed through history to to reach that level of skill. and and as Sowell says it in the book, is like, is it fair for Germans to have such knowledge in beer so that they can be the leaders of the industry? Well, no, but that doesn't mean they are oppressing other beer industries. They just have had accumulated knowledge that others haven't. And it's one of the things that happens, you know. So Bonham Phillips said that we don't live in the past, but the past lives in us. And the German beer is just one of the examples. Which again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's oppressor and oppressed, it's just how societies have developed. Is equal demographics so widespread or so automatic in some endeavors? Which is a legitimate question, because again, we can see this with the Germans. It's like have if they have all this knowledge, and then it can, I mean, it can be more natural for them to go towards that industry and just add more knowledge to it, to the ones that they already have, and to distribute it more. Environment can't be simply about the surroundings, and just like human capital can't be simply as skills and education. There are other qualities that affect how societies develop. One of them is honesty, for example. The amount of honesty or dishonesty a society has, it affects how economically they will develop. One example of this is that it can be the Industrial Revolution. So because the Brits had I guess a reputation of being honest, like more people invested on them because they knew they they weren't gonna backstab them or something. So it's one of the qualities that maybe not a lot of people take in consideration, but it's like if your society has, you know, a reputation of being dishonest, then maybe it won't attract, I mean, not maybe, it actually won't attract as much investors as others could. And this will automatically become a disadvantage for that society. Another natural difference are the sexes. Men and women have different advantages and disadvantages. One of them is that it really doesn't matter how reckless a man can be, he will never get pregnant. And this is a disadvantage for women because women are the ones that get pregnant. So, I mean, it's just a natural disadvantage because when you get pregnant, you're not at your full, physically speaking, and because I mean, you have to also take care of this new life inside of you. So it is natural that I mean, as in, for example, you will have a break in your work career, or even after you give birth, you will have to take some time in order to recover physically. It's a natural disadvantage that no one has any control of it. I mean, we can, I don't know, like nowadays women don't take that long to recover or stuff like that, but it's not that we make someone else get pregnant. And one other factor is that people evolve different. They learn different and at different paces, which will naturally create a disparity. One example of this can be the firstborns. So firstborns are overrepresented among high achievers on any variety of endeavors. And this is natural because a firstborn has the full attention of his or her parents versus the rest. I mean, it's natural that with the following sons and daughters, the attention will be dispersed. And this is another natural difference. On top of this, we can also have the disadvantage, or we can see the disadvantage that children with one parent have. It has been shown that they are, as in kids with one parent, are overrepresented in different kinds of pathologies, going from truancy to murder. The boys, the fatherless boys, are actually more likely to go to be incarcerated, and the girls also have a disadvantage without a father, because they tend to be they tend to get pregnant when they are a teenage. And just like we have these differences between households, we can take just one individual that is different. If you compare yourself to different stages of your own life, you're not gonna be the same. It's gonna be different. Obviously, you become wiser. You acknowledge, you acquire more knowledge. So it's just, I mean, if you as an individual, competing with yourself, it's gonna be different in different stages of your life. It is natural to see that it happens also with groups of people, societies, countries. And there is no reason to assume that existing disparities will remain like this forever. Just like China was more technologically advanced than the European Union, or how the Ottoman Empire was also leading the Roman Empire, it doesn't mean that it will stay like that, because people, society change. So now let's talk a little bit about racism. Racism has become like the automatic explanation for everything in the United States. And I mean, not just in the United States, other people also automatically assume that it's racism, the reason why there are so many disparities. But we can see, I mean, obviously the book centers more in the United States, but even nowadays we can at least listen or more from Americans how they complain about this. However, the dangers of automatically assuming that it's racism, it's like the extent in which this belief it is accepted without even putting it to empirical tests, to subject it to evidence and logic, because then we reach conclusions that won't help anyone. Then another huge danger that is more than clear nowadays, at least for some of us, is that it's how intolerant they are when people show evidence that it's opposite to what they believe, or that it's a counter argument to the arguments that they are giving. They become intolerant and violent, and they just want to censor everyone that is against it. One of the biggest fallacies they do is the ad hominem, because it's easier. These are dangers to the basic functioning of a free society, which is of fallible human beings. Now I will be talking about statistics. However, obviously, if you want to go into even more detail, which is more than possible, everything is in the book. But let's start with the fact that not because there are disparities between races, it means that it's due to race. I mean, I have mentioned some of the factors before, but let's go into more specific examples. For example, in the United States, the median of the black family income has been lower than the median of the white family. The magnitude of this difference hasn't been 2 to 1 since 1947. And however, one addition to this statistic is that the difference per capita between Asian Americans to Mexican Americans is more than twice. So Asians earn more than twice than Mexicans. However, you can also see that Asian Americans earn more than whites, which is one of the details that people tend to overlook is when they are looking at the statistics of black and whites, they fail to also see statistics of other races. And this doesn't mean that, Asian Americans are a minority in the United States. Yet they earn more, and it doesn't mean that they are oppressing the rest of the population. But it's also, there is one more detail to this, and it's also to take in consideration the age of the people, because at different ages you earn more or less. The younger you are, obviously your income is gonna be lesser because you don't have that much experience. So again, it's one other factor that we have to take in consideration when we are reading statistics, or where people just throw at us statistics. Okay, so for example, the different countries have different median age. Germany, Italy, and who else? And Japan have a median age of 40 compared to Afghanistan, Angola, Nigeria, where they have a medium age below 20. So we can assume that, or we can interpret it as it makes sense that these nations have more accumulative income because the average person has worked more, whereas these ones at the average person is just starting to enter the workforce. In addition to this, for example, white female-headed single parent have had a poverty rate more than double than married black couples in the years from 1994 to 2020. And as Sowell said it in the book, it's like, does this mean that racists are only racist towards single black and not when they are married? Different factors affect how we read the statistics. There was a census in 2020 that showed that more than 9 million black Americans had a higher income than the average white American. So I will read this part. Since 1994, the annual poverty rate of black married couples Americans hasn't been as high as 10%, and in no year in more than half a century has the national poverty of Americans as a whole been as low as 10%. So it just adds to the information that maybe these disparities are not entirely about race or racism. And we can see this because there are also disparities within these same groups. So in the United States, for example, they have these two types of schools, the charter public schools and the traditional public schools. And they study, or they took a look about this particular group of Hispanic and Black, where these two schools were in the same building. And when they had to take the mathematics test to see the proficiency, the ones in the charter schools were 6 times as often as reaching this proficiency level than compared to the traditional public schools. And this is within the same races. It had nothing to do with race. It had more to do with the schools. So this difference in proportions don't necessarily mean that it's due to race. It can be because of the single or dual parents that are in the household, due to the age or due to the education. So it's not the wisest thing to jump to conclusions. A Census Bureau study found that Owsley County was the lowest income county in any American state in 2014. And why is this relevant? It's because this county is 99% white. The New York Times Magazine rated different counties in the United States in 2014. And 6 out of 10 were in eastern Kentucky, and the population there, it was 90% white. So again, it's just like, it doesn't mean that it's not the differences, it's just about race. It can be also like the location in which these groups of people are. During 1969 to 2020, there were different studies of these same counties, and they found a very similar pattern in the income. They were consistently below the Black Americans' households nationwide. And one may ask, like, okay, then what is this about? Just like we don't want to jump into the conclusion that whites are oppressing black, we don't want to jump into the conclusion that blacks are oppressing white. One of the reasons is because people living in mountains and foothills, or as Americans like to call it, hillbillies, they usually lag economically and social development because they are farther away from others. In these areas, it tends to be like a higher dropouts from high schools and lower graduates from colleges. So this is an important factor to take in consideration. And just like he said, it's like none of this automatically tells us how much effect discrimination has, or any other factor of the given group's economics or other advancement. If anything, it's just that history has taught us to not jump into conclusions, because again, there are different factors to take in consideration. It is wrongly assumed that the legacy of slavery is correlated to higher incidence of children born to unmarried Black women. The reason for this is because more than a century after slavery ended, the vast majority of Black children were born to married couples. In the 1960s, born children to unmarried Black women rose 23.6% compared to 16.8% from 1940. However, this wasn't only a Black women issue, since the births of unmarried white women also rose during the 60s. This upturn of the races, it was due to the expansion of the welfare during the 60s. So it was like this new pattern has persisted, which tells us that similar outcomes can come from similar behavioral patterns that differ from race. So other disparities in outcomes can be for different behavioral patterns, where we just added one more factor that can affect statistics. The people that love to talk and to be alarmed for these big disparities between Black and white, and they tend to ignore or to show no interest at all in Asian statistics because for some reason only black and white disparities matter. And there is this other misconception that black are the last to hire and the first one to fire. But again, no one takes in consideration that white employees are fired before Asian ones. And this can be for several reasons, because we could have to take in consideration the level in the company that these people were. Because obviously you're as a company, in order to succeed, you're gonna see where you have to cut people. It can vary from different departments and all kinds of different factors that a company has to contemplate in order to keep alive. And as Thomas Sowell's questions or asks is, are we to accept statistical data as evidence when these data fit existing preconceptions, but not accept such data when they go counter to those same preconceptions? And this will bring us to real racism, to what actually happened in the past in the United States, which was genetic determinism. Progressivism was a major new force among Americans at the time, and these American intellectuals were advocating for genetic determinism because they believed that less successful races were genetically inferior. So as we are seeing, this took an opposite conclusion, opposite views on racial issues, because they just went with the preconceptions that they had and jumped to conclusions. So, whereas before this disparity in races was due to genetic determinism, now it is due to victims of racism. And as he said, it is like the conclusions were different, but the way evidence was used and the way contrary views and contrary evidence were disregarded was very similar. How the progressives at the time reached such conclusions was through IQ tests. One of the ways they would measure intelligence, it was with the soldiers in the US Army. And they were given mental tests during the First World War. 100,000 tests were given, and as a whole, the black soldiers had a lower score than the white ones, and they went with that. It was like, see, here is the test. They are way below the white ones, therefore they are inferior. Did they care to look a little bit closer? No, but Sowell did. Well, he showed it in this book. And what he says is like, when there is an internal breakdown of this same test, you can see how blacks from Ohio, Illinois, New York, and Pennsylvania scored higher than the white soldiers from Georgia, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Mississippi, which these latter ones are in the South. And because at the time there was racism, the white people in the South, they didn't want blacks to get any education. So that is one of the reasons the blacks from the South were scoring lower than the white ones. And blacks living in the North had higher IQs than the black ones in the South, because we're seeing one more factor, which is education. And some of the questions that there were in this USA Army were the color of sapphire, the location of Cornell University, the profession of Alfred Noyes, the city in which Pierce Arrow automobile was manufactured. Super random questions because just as Sowell said it, it's like, why would the Black American have this knowledge or recent immigrants? Because that's another thing they were saying at the time, or they were using as evidence at the time. It was to say that because Jews were also taking the test, there were like Eastern European Jews immigrants, and they were taking this test, and the score was lower than the average. So then they were saying like, see, the Jews are not as intelligent as people think they are. But looking at these questions, it's like, why would blacks or recent immigrants had this knowledge if it's not relevant to your life? And as he said, as Thomas Sowell says it, is like, and why would these questions were selected to measure the innate intellect of a person? It's a complete puzzle. And one more factor to take in consideration is that the IQ tests, as in populations, have increased the IQ score throughout generations. So one more time is that it's not like you just stay in one place. With the years, I mean, probably also the questions changed, but I believe there was still one study with these same questions, and it was like, as in later generations could score higher. Progressives in each era began with a preconception, and when they found evidence that fit this preconception, then they saw it as the perfect evidence to show that they were in the right. But when you want to know the truth, you have to keep going and to ask questions about it, to see if you can find evidence that will go against your initial results. And not only they don't do it, but when others do it and they present it, then they are attacked, and people want them to be silent. These crusaders weren't ill-educated nor part of the low class. They were actually well-educated. They were intellectuals, and there was a similar phenomenon in the United States and in England, because in this latter one they even had eugenics society at the Cambridge University. Most of these intellectuals were on the political left. Of course, there were also some conservatives like Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain. Now, in order to keep adding these factors to the IQ test, is that white people living in the Hebrides Island of Scotland and white people living in the canal boat communities in Britain, they had similar IQ to the black ones. And this was due to the black ones in the United States, and this was due to the geographical and social isolation. More factors keep coming in against this genetic determinism. Carl Bregan was one of the ones that was using the IQ tests as evidence to show that the Jews weren't as intelligent as everyone thought they were. However, one factor to take in consideration is that these Jews didn't speak English that well at the time, and it was when they started using English in their households, then their IQ test scores improved, and they were actually above average. Because I don't know why language wasn't taken in consideration to do these tests, but again, it's just people that just have preconceptions that they want to prove as the absolute evidence. Sowell asks, like, what can happen when an idea or a vision becomes a heady dogma? And I mentioned before that one of the main dangers is the freedom against the individual, which later can become against the society. And there was also like literature about this. And The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant was a book that was widely read, and this one actually became the Bible of Hitler. That's how he called it. And if we keep like looking at different scenarios around the world, it also happened in the Roman Empire. With Cicero, he warned his fellow Romans to not buy British slaves because they were very difficult to teach. But it was obvious that it was going to be more difficult to teach them because they were illiterate from these tribes. So when you take an illiterate person from a faraway tribe and you force them to come to your empire, where everything is more complex and sophisticated, obviously it's gonna be difficult to teach them, but it has nothing to do with genetics. And we can also see the ancient Greeks, for example. They were among the creators of mathematics. Euclid in geometry and Pythagoras in trigonometry. But no one believes that the Greeks were more advanced genetically. And these advances actually, it's like it happened there because of geography. Most of the significant advances in man's culture, like agriculture and the smelting of metals, had been in the Middle East, and those advances entered Europe through the Balkan Peninsula, which again is what I was mentioning at the very beginning, that geography can help you to acquire knowledge from other people. And even with this to take in consideration, how the British, how the Roman Empire were buying British slaves. Here, what is important to pay attention is that the Brits weren't the advanced ones. They weren't. I mean, if anything, they were at a great disadvantage. But in the 18th and 19th century AD, Britons led the world into the Industrial Revolution. And in the 19th century, the British Empire had like a fourth of the land of the entire planet. So we can see how the scale turned. Just like the Brits weren't always leading the world, they also didn't stay as the leaders of the entire world. And just like one Italian author said in the 20th century, is how in the first place did a peripheral island rise from primitive squalor to world domination? These are undisputed facts that go against genetic determinism, because different people in Europe were more advanced than others in different centuries, which suggests reciprocal inequalities. The good thing is that era of genetic determinism is now closed. However, it didn't pass without giving without providing rational evidence for genocide. I mean, I just mentioned it wasn't the evidence wasn't there, but people just jumped into those conclusions and went with it, causing a lot of troubles. Now, as Thomas Sowell said, its enduring significance for our era is a painfully urgent warning against intolerant ideological stampedes, even when these stampedes are led by leading scholars and intellectuals and spread by a wide range of institutions. So it is important to always question from where it's coming, this evidence, and what was taken in consideration. If there is one thing that this Sowell wants to make it clear in this book, it's precisely that. It's like, are you looking at all the different factors, or you are just going with what you want to see? Government makes everything worse. And we can see evidence. I mean, maybe not everything all the time, but yes, when we just want the government to fix things without even understanding the problem, which is why it's so important to keep testing the current ideologies so that we can find the best solutions for everyone. So let's start with this Richard T. Ely. He rejected the free market because he saw the government as the amelioration of conditions under which people live or work. He also found the eugenics was just another service or social benefit that the government could provide, which is quite dangerous. And he didn't see the government as a threat to freedom. And also, he was a man of the left. I mean, this is more as in, let's just hear what the other side has to say. And if there is evidence, then let's see if we can, if we can find new evidence that either supports our current evidence or supports the other side, and from there we see which one is correct, or to the very least, which one is closer to the correct assumptions. Woodrow Wilson would also see Puerto Rico as in Puerto Ricans as children versus the Americans as the real men, for when it came to deep matters of government and power. Like other progressives of his time, he didn't see the expansion of government as a threat to freedom. He even defined government benefits as a new form of freedom. Professor Ross referred to us liberals as people who speak for public interest against powerful, selfish private interests. In their own minds, at least, they were advocating for social justice. If we can see, as in now, this at looking at the past, at the history, how people were so convinced that they were right and created so many problems. If we should pay attention to something, it was because they refused to listen to the other side. They would just shut them down by whichever means it was necessary. Later on, there was a widespread belief where there was racial discrimination of lending institutions against blacks because they would be rejected at a higher rate for mortgage loans compared to the white ones. However, if you would keep going with the information, white ones were also rejected at a higher rate than Asians for the same mortgage loans. The reason for this is because when you apply for a mortgage loan, the average credit rate is important, and this rating was varying between these different groups. So the white ones had a higher credit rate than the black ones, and the Asians had a higher credit rate than the white ones, and that was why they were accepting or rejecting mortgage loans accordingly. Also is because when when you apply for a mortgage loan, it's more as in you, with whoever you are interacting with, they feel all the data, but they don't take the decision. Then they send this data to another department of the bank, and they, based on the data that they see, accept or reject. The probability of them having looked at the people's color of the skin, it was quite low. However, there was an outrage from the media, academia, and politics about this racial discrimination. And people started asking and shouting to the government to do something about it. I think we don't know what, just do something. Do something because we want to see different results. The government forced the mortgage lenders to lower the lending standards. So the mortgage loans became very risky, to the point that many people, including Thomas Sowell, warned the government that the housing market would collapse. And it did. So when it did, the whole economy collapsed. And the low-income blacks were among the people who suffered. So various policies are recommended based on desirability, but they don't take in consideration other important factors that in the long run will affect the people that they are trying to help. And this is why it's so important to understand the problem and to listen to the different sides of this problem to understand it better and to find the best solution. But because they prefer desirability so much that they fail to pay attention to the practical questions. And society should arrange, without specifying what society or how it should arrange something. It's more as in, I want a better world, so make it a better world. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. So again, we're forgetting the dangers of giving so much power to politicians, because it's important to understand that the government compel. So if we want the government to meddle with certain aspects or with certain issues, we should, to the very least, make sure that they are gonna do a good job, and we can prevent like trouble if we see things clearly. So because the government compelled, we actually have to be very aware when we are asking for the expansion of the government. And as Thomas Sowell said it, is otherwise that would mean destroying everyone's freedom for the sake of whatever crusade has caught the fancy of some influential segment of the population. And Adam Smith expressed also his opposition to the man of the system, that he thinks that he can arrange society at will because the people are nothing but chess pieces. And by this, it's more as in people are not just inert pieces that you can move around how you please, just because you think you have more knowledge than them. And it's also like this exaltation of desirability neglects the feasibility, which is a major ingredient for these fundamental fallacies of the social justice vision. So we should be also asking factual questions about the effect that this attempt to fix something will actually help, or if it will be counterproductive. We just saw it with the mortgages, but now we will also see it with taxes. People think that, or governments, I mean, I would say everyone, but if the higher the taxes you ask for people, the higher the money the government will have to do whatever they want. But this is not necessarily the case. And one example in history is with Britain and the American colonies. The Brits, they wanted to increase the taxes on the American colonies because they wanted more money. So it seemed, if you think it with a simplistic mindset, it's like, okay, makes sense, no? But in the long run, what happened is that they didn't get any because the Americans were discontent with this. So they rebelled, and the Brits lost. Not only they lost what they could have earned in the taxes, but they lost their colonies, which means that a greater loss than what they were expecting. And something similar happens currently around the world. Sometimes when the taxes are lower, then you attract entrepreneurs. The reduction of taxes doesn't mean less money, just like the increase of taxes doesn't mean increase of money. And this is because people react and people do their part because they are not inert pieces. In addition to this, there are price setting laws that also have an effect on the people. So when the government set prices below the level set by supply and demand, like the amount demanded by the consumers increases, but the amount produced decreases, and this causes a shortage. And this can go to food, gasoline, and a number of other things. And the reason for this is because when the price is low, obviously the consumer will be like, I want it all. If it's a low price, but this the people that produce it are the ones losing money because it's set at a lower price than what it's actually worth. So because they don't want to keep losing money, they reduce the production, and that's why shortages occur. In Zimbabwe in 2007, something like this was applied, which was that because in order to fight inflation, they lowered the prices, but this only caused a food crisis, and it was so bad that the red meat was so expensive that the middle class wasn't able to even buy it in the black market. And this was something that was politically effective because obviously people were like, okay, finally we're able to buy at a lower price. But in the long run, it was disastrous for the society. Okay, so just like laws that set prices low create shortages, laws that set prices up create surpluses. And agriculture is an example of this. Well, there was in USA, and there was also in France. This one is not in the book though, but I remember it's not long ago. The French government had to buy like huge amounts of wine because the surplus was insane. Because what this creates are unsaleable surpluses, and that lead to expensive government programs to buy these surpluses. And how they buy it is with the taxpayers' money. So it really affects everyone. Now we're also gonna talk about the minimum wage. This one is probably one of my favorite topics because Thomas Sowell really opened my eyes in this topic. I used to think that having a minimum wage would benefit people. I was never like a activist of the minimum wage, but it is still good to have this information, whether you go out in the street or not, because you are able to see how I don't know how to say, like, how much the government is able to acknowledge information. um, because the minimum wage is a good amount of time it's used by politicians to gain votes, and it's also a big topic for the social justice advocates to give to the poor, no, or to raise their income, which sounds good. Sounds like it would make sense, like, oh well, now they have more money, uh, but it has effects in different ways. And so, what happens when you increase the minimum wage is that you are increasing the salary of an unskilled beginner to more of what it's actually worth in the market. And when you do this, then people are gonna be less likely to hire more people, because you are paying above the real price, and which is you, the individual, the entrepreneur, the employer, that it's actually using your own money to pay. Whereas before you would have maybe hire 5 people, now maybe you will hire 2 or 3. And this creates a higher percentage of unemployment in unskilled beginners. Actually, the ones that get affected the most, particularly in the United States, for example, are the teenagers. So now we're gonna go with some numbers to showcase how is that having a minimum wage doesn't necessarily help. So back in 1948, in the group age of 16 and 17 years old, Black had 9.4% of unemployment and white had 10.2%. And for the ages of 18 and 19 years old, Black had a 10.5% and white a 9.4%. There was racism back then. No one discusses that. But the minimum wage was actually well below of what the actual job was worth. So it was an ineffective minimum wage, which also which made it easier for these teenagers to get a job. Among them was Thomas Sowell. In 1950, there were increases in order to keep up with the inflation, and the unemployment rate among Black teenagers never fell below 20%, and in some of those years it ranged above 40%. So it was substantially higher, the unemployment rate among Black teenager males versus white teenage males. The difference exceeded 2 to 1. And you would say, like, but why, when there was actually more racism back then than it is now? So what happens when you have a higher minimum wage is that you have more applicants coming to you for a job. But you as an employer, because you have to spend more on unskilled people, you will not hire that many, but you have a bigger pool. So then you can choose to wait for more to apply, or cherry pick who you want to work with. Whereas when you have a lower minimum wage, you what you have less applicants, so you are forced to pick for whatever the pool has. And also maybe you will also hire more people, and this can cause more unemployment again because you are hiring less, but also you can even choose which races you want to hire, and you can have that luxury because your pool is higher. I hope I'm explaining it as it is. If not, read the book. So now let's gonna see the unemployment rate around the world when there is no minimum wage. In 2003, Switzerland had a 3.9%. In 2013, Singapore 2.1%. In 1991, Hong Kong had a 2%. In the 1920s, with the President Coolidge administration, the unemployment rate went from a high of 4.2% to 1.8%. All of this is without minimum wage. So what we conclude is that to deliberately advocate for minimum wage because you think you are helping the low-income people, you are actually making low-income people like you're excluding them from the labor market by doing so. And I mean, this is important to acknowledge because you're harming the people you want to help. At one time, groups were actually targeted for exclusion of the labor market. Among them were Japanese immigrants in Canada and African workers in South Africa, when there was also the apartheid. Racism is an attitude inside people's head and may cost the racist nothing. However, discrimination is an overt act, and this in the real world can cost the discriminator little or much, depending on the circumstances. So, for example, minimum wage reduce the cost of discrimination because of what I just mentioned before, that when you have a bigger pool of applicants and if you're a racist, then because you will receive more applications or whatever, and then you will be like, okay, let me just wait until whites apply and then I will hire whites. Whereas when there is no minimum wage, because the pool is so low, you are like, I mean, you have to keep the business going, so you have to hire as soon as possible. So you hire whatever comes, I mean, it might not sound that pretty, but it's what it is. So because the employer's money is at risk, it's when they can, it's when their discrimination either costs them little or much, depending on the case. And also, we're gonna see this in more detail later on, but private companies that are in like competitive industries are less racist because just by the nature of the industries, you want the skilled workers with you, compared to, for example, non-profit organizations, regulated public utilities, and government agencies, which they are the ones that have a history of discriminatory kinds of employers. And this is because their own money is not at risk, or because they have the monopoly and the taxpayers, I mean, they are using the taxpayers and the taxpayers don't have any other option but to go to the government, So that's why they are throughout history being more racist. And when it comes with the non-profit organizations, I mean, since it still is not their money, because it comes from donations and all that, it's like they can also do whatever they want. I mean, because it doesn't cost them anything. And this also brings us to that people who imagine that benefits that they receive from the government are free because they think other people are paying it. that's not necessarily the case, especially because with inflation, everyone pays. So what happens is that uh, when the government wants to give these benefits to the people, obviously it has to come from somewhere. And sometimes the tax money doesn't cover these benefits. And when this happens, then the government can, as in, can't print more money or tell the Federal Reserves to create more money, which they are legally authorized to create it. But when so much money enters society, the overall value of money goes down. And this affects more the people, because, as in the average person, as in the lower class, because this is a tax on money, which applies. I mean, as in, if more of your asset is money, it will cost you more compared when if you have other assets, like companies or houses, cars, all of these other assets will increase in value, but the money is the one reducing. So that's why it affects more low income people, which leads that they are gonna be paying more for these benefits. And exactly, because it's just a higher percentage of their income. And the biggest beneficiaries of all these are politicians, because they get votes by saying that they are actually giving free stuff. And also because they would promote it as as a right more than a privilege. So now let's try to see how is a discrimination when you have to put your own money doesn't affect as much as when you don't have to do it. When it's not your money at risk, then discrimination is higher. There are these different examples. The first one is prior to World War II, there were like black professors that were virtually non-existent in in non-profit universities and colleges. However, there were hundreds of black chemists in profit-based businesses. And we can see something similar in Poland with the Jewish people. They were 9.8% of the population, but they owned more than over half of all private physicians were Jewish. In the government, they were seldom hired. But one might ask, like, then why is it that in the private they were like overrepresented? And it's because when you are the one that is sick and that is worried about your health and the one that is paying money, you prefer to see a skilled physician over one that is not. So that's why people would go with the Jewish people. And we can see something similar in South Africa during the apartheid, where whole occupations were set aside for whites, but in the competitive industries, the majority were black employees. So history and economy shows that people are not chess pieces, because they take decisions. And again, if it's their money, they will go for the skilled, for the better prepared. And just like Martin Luther King said at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, we'll not judge by the color of their skin, but by the content of the character. But for some reason this has changed. Yes, I mean, nowadays the goal has changed to equal opportunity to equal outcomes, and as we have seen during the entire video so far, there are so many more factors to take in consideration. Like equal outcomes is not, if it's actually like that possible. But let's remember that the politics goal is votes and not the truth, which is one of the many reasons why this book is so relevant for people also, not only to read, to really understand, because if you're able to understand how statistics work and how people in industries or the government use these statistics to manipulate people, then you won't be manipulated by all of them. The income distribution alarmists are always concerned about the 1% of Americans that are so rich, leaving the other 99% behind. But again, it's important to read the trends over time. So what people think when they go after this 1% is that it's as if this 1% is taking away from the 99%, but it's not necessarily like that. So what I thought, it was like a cake. It's not like this 1% is taking half of the cake and leaving the other half to the people to divide it equally among them. What they are doing, I mean, most of the cases, what happens is that they increase the size of the cake, and by increasing the size of the cake, you're increasing the pieces these 99% are also gonna take. But because you are the one that increased the size of the cake, I mean, if since you put the work and the risk, of the money and the investment, then I don't see why you shouldn't have a bigger piece of the cake that you increased. Because by increasing it, you didn't just increase it for yourself, but also for the people. And I mean, yes, not everyone is gonna be a millionaire, but that doesn't mean the millionaires are actively taking away money from the rest of the people. What Sowell says is like, if the same people would stay in the same income bracket through their entire lifetime, then there would be like valid reasons for such conclusions that the 1% is taking away from the rest. But it's not the case, since the people through the years, they move through the different income brackets. So there are these statistics. More than half of all Americans adults are in the top 10% of income recipients at some point in their lives, usually in the later years. So again, it makes sense because you have now more experience in the workforce, and you have acquired more knowledge than someone that is a beginner. There was a study at the University of Michigan, followed specific individuals from 1975 to 1991. These individuals were at the bottom 20% of the income bracket. And that's how they started in 1975. By 1991, 29% of those that were in the lowest quintile had risen all the way up to the top quintile, and only 5% remained in the bottom quintile. Meanwhile, the people in the top quintile were the ones that saw the smallest increase in real income. A later study on Internal Revenue Services from 1996 to 2005 saw that the bottom quintile in this group saw their income rise 91%, and the top 1% saw the income fall for 26% during that same decade. In Canada, from 1990 to 2009, 87% of the bottom quintile rose into the higher quintile, and this quintile rose higher rate and larger absolute amount than those initially in the top quintile. I mean, okay, it's like a huge difference. Like, I mean, the fact that they're able to move, it's good news. So let's not discourage. But okay, so there was also a difference with these three studies that I just mentioned versus the ones that are more cited from the US Bureau of the Census. And it's what they measure. These three studies followed the same individuals from a period of time. And which becomes to one of the main differences to the more cited study, because the data on statistical categories, because this other study, the one of the US Bureau of the Census, had different categories with multiple individuals, each as families, households, or consumer units. But just as different families have different numbers of members, I mean, the categories would have different numbers, which would make it not accurate. So these categories of incomes were divided into income quintiles, and these quintiles can contain equal numbers of such categories, but not equal numbers of people. I guess to make it a little more clear, it's like, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics said that in 2019 there were like around 42 million people in the bottom and 84 million people at the top. And these comparisons are have a built-in exaggeration, because if even if everyone is earning the same, let's say everyone is earning $10, let's say everyone is earning $1, and if you compare them by the numbers, the people at the bottom will have 42 million and the people at the top will have 84 million. But that is because the numbers are different. It's not necessarily because someone is stealing from them. So the income alarmists have their choice of statistics to use, and such conclusions sometimes can arise from naivete for not knowing about statistics, but sometimes it is with a bias. And one example of this one is Tom Wicker, which was a columnist for the New York Times. And when he depicted the success of the Lyndon Johnson administration, he used per capita income, compared when he depicted the failure of the Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush administration, he used the family income statistics. I mean, in one, you are comparing individuals that actually work, and in the other one, you're comparing families that may have different number of children. They might be married or just single parents. So, I mean, you're comparing something different. You don't have the correct data. So it's one of the ways you can easily showcase something inaccurate by making it look like you actually know something. And it is similar with poverty statistics, because what are you comparing and what does poverty mean? And these ones are important questions that must be answered before doing the study, so that you know what you are evaluating. But as Sowell says, it's like, in this data, official poverty means whatever the statisticians say it means, no more, no less. And it's also important to, again, one more time, to take in consideration the age. The peak of earnings has moved from 35 to 44 years old, which that was in the past, and now it's more in the 45 to 54 years old. And which with this is like knowledge has become more valuable relative to the physical vitality of the youth. And as Alan Reynolds said, very strong opinions about very weak statistics. I truly believe we all should learn more about statistics, especially how, I mean, not to become statisticians, but to see, to ask the correct questions and to see how is that certain people are using uh, statistics for their own purposes. One more aspect to take in consideration is knowledge. Many people don't regard all information as deserving to be called knowledge. However, knowledge doesn't have a hierarchy. Some people in either category, I mean, some knowledge in either category is more consequential than other knowledge. And that varies in the circumstances and the kinds of decisions people are gonna make. Rather than varying in complexity and elegance of the knowledge itself. So how much knowledge is in a given society and how it is distributed depends crucially on how knowledge is conceived and defined. Now, this is important because some people, some intellectuals, or yes, well-educated people, they think that they know better than others that may not have that much education or that much money. That's why it's important to understand consequential knowledge, because not because you are more educated, it means that you know what is best for a particular person under a particular set of circumstances. And a lot of the problems that have occurred and occur nowadays, it's because you have this set of people that think that they know best than others, that they know better. And we're gonna see how this is wrong. There are surrogate decision makers, and it's just people that want to take decisions for others. John Rawls was a social justice advocate, and he would refer to the society should be arranged for certain outcomes, which this falls in the collectivism because it means that it's collective decisions of a kind that a government makes using knowledge available to surrogate decision makers. But this obviously doesn't take in consideration the individuals that of the population at large, that they will know better for themselves, for their own lives. And just like an old saying, a fool can put on his coat better than a wise man can do it for him. And we're gonna see how is that this has an effect. It's a quote that I very much liked, and it's crusades for idealistic goals is a painful record of how often the granting of great powers to governments in pursuit of those goals lead instead to totalitarian governments, and it's the bitter theme of the revolution betrayed. And we can see this as far as the French Revolution. Economist H.A. Hayek said that consequential knowledge included not only the articulated information, but also unarticulated information embodied in behavioral responses to known realities. So, not all knowledge in this sense is part of our intellect, nor is our intellect the whole of our knowledge. Our habits, skills, emotional attitudes, tools, and our institutions all are in this sense adaptations to past experience, which have grown up by selective elimination of less suitable conduct. They are as much an indispensable foundation of successful action as is our conscious knowledge. And economist Leonard Read said that no individual possesses all the knowledge required to produce all components of a pencil. And It's simple as that example. Like you alone cannot achieve this pencil in the most efficient and optimum way. So you need other people that have access to these other materials, just like the graphite, the wood, the metal, the gum, to create the entire pencil. You need other people's knowledge to reach a goal. In this case, it's a pencil. So the choices of institutional mechanism actually matter, not only from economic efficiency, but for the sake of preserving freedom of millions of people to make their own decisions about their own lives as they see fit, rather than have these surrogate decision makers preempt their decisions in the name of noble sounding words such as social justice. Uh, because it's the vagueness when they refer to society and to just fix it, it really causes more problems than the ones that we currently have. And there are very different conceptions of decision makers because they reflect different beliefs about the distribution of consequential knowledge. We're gonna go and see some examples about how these people that think that they know better just end up harming the people that they are allegedly helping. There was this case, United States, of payday loans. So these payday loans are used for by people that have low income for emergencies, such as for health issues, for if the car is not working, to buy medicine. Exactly. It's just like just problems that occur without out of nowhere, because they don't have the money in that moment to fix the problem. Then they go for these payday loans. Now, these payday loans, the quantity that they are giving, it's quite low compared to the ones in the bank. Like the banks are not gonna just borrow you $100, which these payday loans do. So you have to pay. How this works is that you have to pay $15 to borrow $100 until the end of the month. And the social justice advocate said that this was exploitation because it was like a high percentage. But and they started crying to the government to do something about it. It's just like just something. So then some states imposed interest rates caps, which it was enough for these business loans to shut down. And as a result, the low-income people now they don't have money to fix the emergency problems because there are no more payday loans. But what it's important to understand is that the costs are a higher percentage of all costs when a small amount of money is borrowed. It doesn't cost a bank 100 times to process a 10K as it costs a payday loan business to process a loan of $100. Because with that money, with those $15, you're not only, because you're taking the risk, obviously, but you're giving $100 for $15. So first you have that risk, and then you have to pay the employees. You have to pay, I don't know, the rent of the business, and you have to pay the light and all that stuff, utilities. And that's why you have that high percentage. And the banks, because they have more money moving around, that's why it doesn't cost to them that much. It's just like how it's like when there is like a lot of one product, the price goes down. But when there is little of a product, the price goes up. and it's also to keep the balance in the economy. So it's the same with these payday loans versus the banks. And okay, so again, what we saw was the effect of of trying to fix something that there was no need to fix, and then you just affected these low income people because they ended up with nothing, just more problems. Another example of these surrogate decision makers is, well, it was the slum clearance. Uh, so they ordered, the surrogate decision makers, they ordered the slums turned down and used the police to evict tenants who didn't want to live. Okay, so these slums, it was like apartments that where a lot of people were living in them. I think like 4 people per room. The people living in those slums were mostly immigrants and who chose to live there because that way they were able to save money in order to bring their family members from abroad to the United States. And so, I mean, this was actually very important because, as in, it's very important to know these groups of people because we're gonna see more clearly the consequential knowledge. Uh, for example, the Jewish immigrants, uh, they had family members back in Eastern Europe where they were being attacked by anti-Semitic mobs, and they needed that extra money that they were saving in the rent to pay for the fares for the family that very much needed to escape. And similar, it was with Italian immigrants, that it was mostly men who had family members in the south areas, in the south poor areas of Italy, and they would be sending money to them. And some of these men even skimmed food in the slums. We also have the Irish immigrants who back home there was a crop failure, so it caused famine, and they needed that extra money to pay for the fares. But these surrogate decision makers, it never crossed their mind anything of why would people be living there, what kind of people were living there, for what they needed the money. They only cared for a better housing and they built replacements. And obviously this caused for all those people to move to higher rents, and even when these housing replacements were built, it was still, it wasn't for all the people that they moved out there for them to return, because since now they had a better housing, the rent was higher. So they only affected the people they were kind of trying to help. But what is important is that they felt good about it. It's like, oh, we changed the slums. These social justice crusaders can go feeling good about themselves after depriving poor people of the very few options that they had in the first place. And crusading intellectual elites that ordinary people may have more consequential knowledge about their own circumstances than distant surrogates have. These surrogate decision makers, with great confidence in their own supposedly superior knowledge and understanding, they just create problems uh, because they don't want to understand other points of views. And which brings us to condescension, which is one of the main issues that I criticize the most of these people that think that they go around helping others. First, we have William Godwin. Explicitly articulated reason was the source of knowledge and understanding. Just views of society in the minds of the liberally educated and reflecting members of society will enable them to to the people, guides and instructors, as influencers to the public, who in turn were expected to influence the government. And what I added here, it was like some kind of shepherd, because it really is just like that, it's like, look, I know better than you. I don't know your circumstances. I don't know what are your motives. All I know is that these slums look bad, and it mustn't be nice to be living here. So I will just make it look pretty for you. And after that, it will look pretty. You won't be living here. Probably you won't find another place where you can save money, but it looks pretty. It looks better, and that's all that matters, um, it's this kind of because and it's just so annoying, because it's not only that they think that they know better, they don't even want to listen to these people. They are just like, from my point of view, this could be better. And it's just like, I mean, yes, but did you test your knowledge by talking to the people you're supposed to help? No, because you're the shepherd. So why would you? Another case is John Stuart Mill, who saw the population at large as having more knowledge than the government. He also saw the population as needing the guidance of elite intellectuals, because they are more highly gifted and instructed. I mean, you don't need to be an expert in a subject to understand your own circumstances and the decisions you have to make as an individual. And this is one of the greatest problems with collectivism. And it's just like, what makes you think you know better about someone else's life? Ironically, the Industrial Revolution, but this Thomas Sowell, it's just it's just brilliant, the examples that he gives, because this is just a beautiful example of how wrong they are and they have been. In the Industrial Revolution was taking place during Mill's lifetime. And why is this important? Because the Industrial Revolution was made by men with practical experience in the industry rather than intellectual and scientific education. It was the working class. Thomas Edison and Henry Ford had very little formal schooling. And what did they achieve? The first airplane to lift off the ground with a human being on it was invented by two bicycle mechanics, the Wright brothers, who never finished high school. Indispensable role of intellectuals in human progress has been one shared by many intellectuals over the centuries. These have included intellectuals leading crusades for more economic equality, based ironically on their own sense of superiority. And obviously all of this falls into extremes, and I will be quoting just a couple of these extremes. And one is Karl Marx, who said that the working class is revolutionary or it's nothing. In other words, he was like, if the working class won't fight for the Marxian vision, then they are nothing. Or Simone de Beauvoir, that I know she's loved by so many feminists, which I really don't understand why. She said, no woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children. Society should be totally different. What makes you think that all women want to not raise their own children? But she knows better. Ralph Nader said that the consumer must be protected at times from his own indiscretion and vanity. If a person earned their own money, why aren't they allowed to spend it how they please, especially if it's in nothing illegal? It's just like, if you're that worried, you can tell them, you can maybe teach them how to save, but you shouldn't advocate for laws to tell them how to spend their money, or if they should have the right or not to raise their children, or if they actually prefer a communist over a free market system. It's when people annoy me. Um, so just how Sowell says it is like to casually advocate imprisoning people who had committed no crime and denying them a normal life on the basis of unsubstantial beliefs that that were then in vogue in intellectual circles. It's absolutely grotesque. F.A. Hayek regarded the assumptions of crusading intellectuals as the fatal conceit. He was a landmark figure in opposition to the presumed superiority of intellectuals as guides, and he wasn't alone. It's also worth mentioning that he was a Nobel Prize winner, same as Milton Friedman, who was with him when they were like in opposition to what the intellectuals were saying, because even Friedman mentioned that he talked to the media, academia, financial community, among others, and he was appalled by the intellectual homogeneity of acceptance of a standard set of views, complete with cliché answers to every objection, of smug self-satisfaction at belonging to an in-group. How intellectuals feel superior to other people, it's disgusting. I mean, for me. And all of this comes or boils down because by thinking that they know better, they absolutely close the door to those who have different points of views, whether they're in direct opposition or just slightly questioning. They just shut the door down. How are you supposed to learn and to increase your beloved knowledge if you're not willing to even listen to what other has to say? So people seeking similar goals can reach radical different conclusions, as we have seen. And it really boils down to the different beliefs about the nature and distribution of consequential knowledge. And honestly, that it also is like, how much are you willing to accept that you don't know it all, that you might be wrong? The social justice agenda tends to focus its attention on correcting institutional and societal defects by having the government empower surrogate decision makers to rescue victims. But I have just mentioned a couple of examples how they did the exact opposite. Friends and defenders of the less fortunate are oblivious, at best, of the harm that they are doing to those same less fortunate. But if you bring these facts and these statistics that show the opposite, then you are the one that lacks empathy. So the fundamental problem in an institutional level is when the laws allow third-party surrogate decision makers to take decisions where they are not gonna pay a price for being wrong, no matter how the price paid by others whom they are supposedly helping. This extends to also education. For example, we're going to talk about sex education in the United States. Intellectuals, it's something that this also doesn't happen just in the United States. What intellectuals tend to do around the world is to go after the children. And what does this mean? Is to go into colleges, high schools, to middle schools, you name it, so that they can influence the future of society. And they have done it several times throughout different times around different countries. But we're going to talk specifically about United States, about sex education, and about what Planned Parenthood did. So, Planned Parenthood testified before a congressional subcommittee that it was needed to create programs in order to prevent out-of-wedlock births and early marriage necessitated by pregnancy. And similar arguments were also done by of venereal diseases, because they just wanted to prevent it. They just said, we want to create it, basically. Did they ask for facts? No. Did they provide facts? No. Because if there would have been like a study or like facts presented or even a discussion about it, then they would have found out that the venereal diseases were actually declining for years. They had been declining for years. Gonorrhea declined every year from 1950 to 1958, and for syphilis, the infection in 1960 was half of the infection in 1950. The pregnancy rate among teenage girls had also been in decline more than a decade. But no one cared. They followed it, they created these programs, this education, and we have the facts of what happened after this implementation. Teenage gonorrhea tripled among teenage between 1956 and 1975. Syphilis continued in decline, but at a much slower rate than it was previously, starting in 1961. The pregnancy among 15 and 19 years old rose 68 per thousand in 1970 to 96 per thousand in 1980. And the data of birth rates differ numerically due to the abortions and miscarriages, but the pattern over the years was similar. The sex education was introduced to public schools in 1960, and I will be showing the birth rate among unmarried females aged between 15 and 19 years old. This is per thousand. Later on I will be saying the percentage. So in 1950 it was 12.6, 1960 15.3, 1970 22.4, 1980 27.6, and at the end of the century, which was 1999, it was 40.4 per thousand. Now, as per the percentage in this same age bracket, the births of unmarried females were in 1950 13.4%, 1960 14.8%, 1970 29.5%, 1980 47.6%. In 2000 it was 78.7%. It's also worth mentioning that their sex education was to show explicit sexual acts to 13-14 years old. Whoever protested was labeled as a fundamentalist and as a far-right extremist, and other types of ad hominem rather than giving counter arguments. And it's also very important to mention, because I don't know if this is just United States, but sex education is not just about sex. It also has to do with biology. So I don't know why they showed this explicit content and without telling the parents. And there was this testimony of Sergeant Shriver, which gave in 1978 in the front of the Congressional Committee, and I will be quoting, "Just as venereal diseases has skyrocketed 350% in the last 15 years, when we have had more clinics, more pills, and more sex education than ever in history, teenage pregnancy has risen. Whether these interests are political, ideological, or financial, they target children, because again, they are the easy ones to indoctrinate and to make them have your own ideology so that you change the future of society. And so by controlling what is inscribed in these young and blank minds have remained a key factor of social crusades to remake the world, to fit the preconceptions of intellectual elites who see themselves as key professors of consequential knowledge." If you really care, then you would try to understand the statistics to begin with, and then the problem, so that you can solve it. Now, but what all of this brings us are the patterns in a broad scale. and it comes with politics. In politics, the word crisis often means the situation that someone wants to change. Now, I will be mentioning some of the progressives. Woodrow Wilson was the president of the Princeton University, and he saw the role of the educator as to make the young gentlemen of the rising generation as unlike their fathers as possible. I mean, not only like who gave them that role, but it's also like what makes you think that the fathers were so bad, or that the fathers don't have anything good to add to the education of their own children. And Professor John Dewey of Columbia University said that schools are to eliminate the obvious social evils through the school's development of children and youth, but also the future of society. Because the role of these educators is they see themselves as promoters of the progressive vision of society and doing all of this behind children's parents. Ironically, the intellectual elites, then and now, seem to regard themselves as advocates of democratic society when they preempt other people's decision. Make it make sense. Woodrow redefined freedom as the new freedom, because it was an additional freedom for these recipients of the government policies or the government provided benefits. Because again, it's your right, it's not a privilege. And not just that, it's completely free for you. We have seen how it is not. And he made the issue of people's loss of freedom disappear as if by verbal sleight of hand. And as Sowell said it, rhetorically at least, people were being emancipated rather than losing freedom. There were also Yale professors who redefined freedom by the things that one's received rather than the autonomy preserved. And they said it, they express it. We shall try to unravel some of the complexities in the theory and practice of freedom. Their conception of freedom was the absence of obstacles to the realization of desires. The complexities of the Wilsonian definition of freedom are certainly understandable, since evading the obvious can become very complex. I very much love that phrase. In conclusion, what the public at large wanted faded into the background. And because people shut down people with other views, these intellectuals, these progressives, so superior to the rest of us, they just shut down all the arguments that one might have against their points of view with ad hominem instead of giving counter arguments. And so it's also like to be careful about the methodology that it is used for certain statistics. It's also important to see the entire complex, the entire factors, in order to not jump into not only wrong conclusions, but conclusions that might affect in a very negative way people that it's supposed to help. And it's also very important to understand people's freedom to make their own decisions, and because it's not only because people know better about their own lives, but it's also because if you keep expanding government and if you keep wanting the government to fix everything, it not only won't fix anything, it won't only create more problems, but in addition, it will be very easy for the government to become into a totalitarian authority, which is, I believe, what most people don't want. It doesn't matter on which side you are, you really want your freedom. If you're right in your mind. It's also important to question the intentions of these intellectuals, to be aware if they are manipulating or not the information. And yes, exactly. government involvement is never a good idea. I mean, obviously, to a certain extent, it is not, but we should be very careful as the public, as the average person, to not ask or advocate for the government to take decisions on our lives without understanding what we are advocating for. And I will close this with my favorite quote of the book, and is, "We each have our own island of knowledge in a sea of ignorance. Some islands are larger than others, but no island is as large as the sea." Beautiful. I mean, because we are all fallible human beings, and if we want to reach the best solution or the best outcome for society as a whole, we should talk to one another. We should share our own points of views, arguments, and try our best for us together to reach to the best solution possible. And to never forget that even though we would all love a utopia world, it is not possible. So we have to also acknowledge that. And this time too, for sure. Oh, okay, there is actually one more thing that I want to read from the book. Because I really love how he writes, how he explains, how he presents the information, as in Thomas Sowell. I will just read this paragraph and hopefully end the video. Intellectual elites with outstanding achievements within their own respective specialties may give little thought to how ignorant they may be on a vast spectrum of other concerns. Even more dangerous than ignorance, however, is a fallacious certitude, which can afflict people at all educational levels and all IQ levels. While we may not see our own fallacies, the saving grace in this situation is that we can often see other people's fallacies much more clearly, and they can see ours. In a world of inevitably fallible human beings with inevitable different viewpoints and different fragments of consequential knowledge, our ability to correct each other can be essential to preventing our making fatally dangerous mistakes as individuals or as a society. The fatal danger of our times today is a growing intolerance and suppression of both opinions and evidence that differ from the prevailing ideologies that dominate institutions. Stupid people can create problems, but it often takes brilliant people to create a real catastrophe. For us to reconsider before joining their latest stampedes, led by self-congratulatory elites, deaf to arguments and immune to evidence. There is obviously more in the book. So much to learn, honestly. I want to read all of his books, all of his essays, everything. I just love him very much. And I hope I explained myself better. Either way, I would highly recommend the book, especially for everyone living in a democracy government, so that we don't fall into a totalitarian government. And with that said, I love Thomas Sowell.